Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of two keynote lectures in our conference, Illumination from Aquinas and Maimonides and Meanings Today. Welcome to everybody in the room, and welcome to all of our visitors who are watching online. The scholars who are contributing to the conference during the day have already heard this, but I'm going to bore you with 2 minutes about how this conference got started, which was with me sitting in my study, minding my own business, working on Schelling, who was trying very hard to get away from the material world. And from nowhere, the idea came to me, Maimonides would never go along with that the human species cannot get away from materiality. Where did that idea come from? Dropped from heaven. Of course, we still have revelations from God today. Second, I was sitting alone in my study, minding my own business and working on Thomas Aquinas and his notion of an analogical relationship with God. And once again, divine revelation, I thought, Maimonides would never go along with that. And now you're waiting for the third time, right? Everything comes in threes. The third time comes with people now ask me, how are you dealing with the world situations that are so stressful in so many parts of the world today, here in 2025? And I say, oh, by spending a lot of time in the 12th century as an escape, right? Because these, Maimonides and Aquinas, were Aristotelian rationalists. I understand those guys, even if I don't quite understand much of the world today. And so I brought this idea to Stefan Steiner at the Catholic Academy, who better to host and co-organize this conference with me, along with Patrick Zoll, an Aquinas scholar who's probably here somewhere, up there. Thank you very much. And so we are gathered together tonight. I would also like to thank everybody at the Catholic Academy who has made all the arrangements to make this conference possible. Tonight we're hearing, because it's Aquinas and Maimonides, we have two keynote speeches. The first, we will begin with Barbara Hallensleben. And she is a professor of dogmatics and theology of ecumenism at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Fribourg. Her research focuses on questions on the foundation of theology in the face of secular thought, as well as on Sergei Bulgakov as an economist, philosopher, and theologian, and the reception of Bulgakov's work for contemporary thought. And finally, her work focuses on Giorgio Agamben and the impulses of his philosophical work for theology. Our second keynote speaker will be Josef Stern, who is the William H. Colvin Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the University of Chicago, and served as the inaugural director of the Joyce Z. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. He works in both medieval Jewish and Arabic philosophy and contemporary philosophy of language. Among his recent publications are Metaphor in Context, Quotations and Pictures, and The Matter and Form of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, which was awarded the 2014 Book Prize by the Journal of the History of Philosophy for the best book in history of philosophy, published in 2013. He is presently at work on a book on Maimonides' epistemology of prophecy. With that brief introduction, we will welcome our first speaker, Barbara Hallensleben. Yes? Josef first? I've been informed that Joseph Stern is going first. Why should I know? I apologize, and Joseph Stern will begin our keynote. We will, after both speakers speak, and you have both Aquinas and Maimonides in your minds, we will, of course, take questions from the audience. I think it is preferred for technical reasons that the questions be in English. I think that would be helpful owing to headsets, microphones, and other wired devices. Thank you very much. Joseph Stern.
Can I close this? The computer? Yes. Yeah?
Oh, can you close it?
Yeah. You know, I have an identical twin brother with whom I'm constantly confused, but this is the first time I've ever been confused for Barbara. Okay, I want to just thank Marcia Paley and Stefan Steiner and Patrick Zoll for inviting me to this conference and making it possible. It's already proving itself to be a very, very intellectually exciting encounter. I was asked to speak about Maimonides on religion and state, a contemporary heading that covers a constellation of issues connected to the place of religion and the religious rights of individuals in liberal democracies. For Maimonides, this topic can be reconceived in terms of his idea of a divine law and his claim that the law of Moses, the Torah, is a divine law, and its relation and tensions with individual perfection. To spell this out, I'll first begin with some background, to fill in some background, beginning with a preliminary remark about the Arabic term Sharia that's often translated in English as law with a capital L, or the law, and in Hebrew as Torah. These translations are misleading insofar as the Arabic term does not refer exclusively to the Mosaic Torah or even to religious law, be it Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, except in specific contexts. As Joel Kramer has argued, often it means generic law, the genus for all particular laws, religious or civil. And that's what the term means when Maimonides argues that Sharia, or law, the capital L, originates out of natural antinomy or tension in nature. Unlike all other animals, humans would perish if each person had to rely on their own autonomous resources. Humans require the cooperation of each other for their nourishment, their protection from the elements and from each other. Survival, that he writes, cannot be achieved in any way by one isolated individual. So natural bodily needs drive the social impulse. But competing with this drive to socialize are the radically different emotional profiles and moral psychologies of different individuals that make social units near impossible to achieve. Some people are so cruel, Maimonides says, that they would kill their little children out of anger. Others are so full of pity, so tender, that they can't bear the sight of killing a bug. These polar opposite personality traits challenge cooperative social relations. The upshot: individual humans cannot live without one another, but they also can't live with one another. The solution: a ruler who is both a manager and who sees to basic order and cooperation, and this is number 1 on your handout, engages the actions of the individuals, perfecting that which is deficient, reducing that which is excessive. Okay, and remember, keep in mind that those two extremes, and who prescribes actions and moral habits that everyone must always practice in the same way, so that the natural diversity is hidden through the multiple points of conventional accord, and so that the community becomes well ordered. This ruler lays down or legislates normative binding prescriptions or laws that resolve the individual personality conflicts and coordinates practices for the common good. But these are at best contingent and conventional. That is, for any one set of laws, there are always different laws that could have been equally well prescribed. Now, this is a fully naturalistic explanation of how governance through law enables human society to exist despite itself. Maimonides also describes this emergence of law, and here I'm just going to read what's bold in number 2. Part of the wisdom of the deity, all right, is by putting the faculty of ruling, tadbir, governance, into the nature of some of its members. But the deity's role here is not to give a law, but simply to create a natural power in some humans to govern themselves and others. So Maimonides concludes, and this is in 3, although the law is not natural, what is natural enters into, or is an entrance to, an opening, a preface to it. That is, either law emerges from nature to resolve its own internal tensions, or law is the realization, or entelechy, the perfection, of a natural faculty of governance. Again, nothing divine or metaphysical to this story. Against this background, Maimonides introduces his novel idea of a divine law as opposed to a nomos. But this distinction is itself defined in terms of 2 other distinctions. What he calls, and this is number 4 in your handout, the welfare, okay, alternatively can be translated as happiness or soundness, which is always of a community, as opposed to perfection, kamal shleimut, and here this is his term for Aristotle's notion of entelechy, the full realization of an individual's potentiality, ability, or capacity, and perfection is always of an individual. And for each of these, perfection and welfare, he distinguishes 2 brands. This is B, of the body and of the soul. Here in B, Maimonides employs contrasting terms that mean, however, different things depending on whether they qualify welfare or perfection. Let's take communal welfare first. I summarize this in number 5. Welfare of the body of the community refers first to the satisfaction of citizens' bodily needs and desires. In other words, the basic material needs that originally drive individuals to form societies to survive, and then, once they're already formed, to achieve what they deem or imagine to be happiness, flourishing. Okay? And second, it includes either minimally the prevention of interpersonal injustice, prevention of reciprocal wrongdoing, and optimally makes each individual do what's useful to the whole and for life in society. Okay? That's welfare of the body. Welfare of the soul of the community is the inculcation and education of citizens to hold correct or sound opinions about the sublunar world or nature, and about God and his so-called angels, which is Maimonides' term following the Arabs for God's secondary causes, thereby cultivating their rational faculties, in other words, their ability or power to achieve actual knowledge and a shared appreciation of the value of wisdom and understanding. Welfare of the soul of the community is not yet scientific understanding, episteme or ilm, okay? Understanding why something occurs, but it's a disposition to achieve that higher state. Turning now to perfection, which is always of individuals, perfection of one's body consists in, this is 6, being healthy and in the very best bodily state, and perfection of the soul of an individual is the human's ultimate perfection. In other words, his ultimate realization or entelechy. And this is to have an intellect in Act 2, an intellect that's fully realized, its potential or ability. And this would consist in knowing everything concerning all the beings that's within the capacity of man to know in accordance with his ultimate perfection. It's qualified, but this is scientific understanding. Why something is true, not only that it is. You can already see how different are communal welfare and individual perfection, and in particular, how much more demanding is perfection of the individual soul than the welfare of the communities, of the communal soul. Now, because law is given to a community, not to individuals per se, it's communal welfare at which law aims, not individual perfection. But that, of course, raises questions about potential tensions between them, and I'll come back to that issue at the end of my talk. With these notions of welfare and perfection of body and soul, let's turn back to Maimonides' distinction between divine law and a nomos. 7. A law, and again, this is any generic law, that aims only to achieve the welfare of the community's body, to satisfy the citizens' bodily needs and desires, maintain law and order. That's what Maimonides calls a nomos. In contrast, 8, a law, all of whose ordinances are due to attention being paid to the soundness of the circumstances pertaining to the body, and also to the soundness of belief. A law that takes pains to inculcate correct opinions with regard to God in the first place, with regard to the angels, desires to make men wise, to give him understanding, to awaken his attention, to cultivate his rational faculty or power, so that he should know the whole of that which exists in its true form. That law is divine. In other words, a divine law is not merely a set of what we think of as a law, a set of regulations or rulings for a minimal or flourishing welfare state. Essentially, it's a pedagogical institution to nurture, cultivate a specific personality type of citizen. This is a sense of law, like one of the meanings of the word Torah, derived from hora'ah, instruction or teaching. But as important, notice that Maimonides' divine law is not a set of prescriptive practices by which one worships a deity. There's nothing about worship here. And keep in mind that this definition is of any generic divine law, not a specific one like the Mosaic Torah. Most strikingly, it refers only to the content or purpose of the law, not to the identity of its giver, God or his prophet. So if German or American or even Israeli law aim not only at the citizens' bodily welfare, but also at the welfare of their souls, at inculcating correct beliefs and values, they would be divine laws. And even if God himself gave a law that did not aim at the welfare of the soul of the community, it would not be a divine law. With this definition of a generic divine law, Maimonides next argues that the Mosaic Torah, and only the Mosaic Torah, in fact satisfies these defining conditions and therefore is uniquely the divine law. But there's one preliminary question. Why should a law that aims to achieve the welfare of the communal soul and its body, but primarily of its soul, be said to be divine? We just said that its divinity is not because of the identity of its giver or legislator. It also can't be because its aim is to cultivate its citizens' rational faculty by teaching correct opinions, and even if that ultimately leads to individual intellectual perfection. Because Maimonides' deity is not an intellect, even the first intellect, and it's obviously not a rational faculty or power or potentiality. Maimonides' God, following Avicenna, is a necessarily existent being in itself, which is not an intellect and not intelligible, but characterized by its absolute uncausedness, its lack of any explanation for its existence, and its unity. Likewise, what makes the Mosaic law divine is not that it's metaphysically perfect. It's no more than what Maimonides calls, in the very qualified phrase, the most perfect law as it's possible to be in its species. And that only when it's judged by a perfect human who has achieved his human perfection or entelechy. And finally, its relative perfection consists in its being no more than, quote, the greatest possible equivalence possible in the species in question. Again, very relativized, and we'll come back to see what that is. It's not some sort of ideal achievement. It's not Aristotle's golden mean. And we'll later see what the actual equivalence is in practice. I want to propose that what makes a law divine for Maimonides is that it's natural. Recall passage number 3. Unlike a nomos that only originates from natural bodily needs and seeks only bodily welfare, a divine law not only emerges from nature, but is directed to the natural entelechy, or perfection, of humanity. And I emphasize, of humanity, not of God. And the perfection of humanity is rational and intellectual. Furthermore, a divine law is natural inasmuch as it achieves its natural end through means that imitate the natural world. This interpretation of divine as natural emerges in multiple passages in the guide. The most revealing one introduces Maimonides' explanation of the Mosaic commandments in the first line of, skipping ahead, 19, if you can look at there, where he identifies, it's in bold, divine actions, I mean to say, the natural actions. Similarly, to interpret the verse, this is passage number 9, and the tablets were Masei Elohim, divine works. He writes, the existence of the 10 tablets of the Decalogue was natural and not artificial, for all natural things are called the divine work. Now, the sense in which the divine law is natural also emerges from Maimonides' 2 explications of the term nature. In 10, that's the physician's account of nature, and in 11, the philosopher's explication. I won't read these passages, but both of them describe nature as a force, kua, a faculty, a power, that brings living, animate beings, in other words, animals, into existence, connects their bodily parts to generate and sustain them, and aims, like the law, okay, at the body's welfare. Okay. There are differences between the 2 descriptions I don't have time to discuss, but significantly, both take as their paradigm of nature the living biological activities of animal bodies. Biology, as Maimonides' exemplar of nature, also emerges in his interpretation of Maimonides' prophetic vision in Exodus 33. This is what's known as Nikradat Sur, the vision in the cleft of the mountain. That vision serves, according to Maimonides, as Moses' archetype for his Mosaic law. Maimonides makes 2 requests of God. One, knowledge of God's essence and true reality. In other words, knowledge of metaphysics. That's denied to Moses. He has no knowledge of metaphysics. And second, knowledge of God's attributes, which Maimonides explicates as God's actions. These actions are revealed to Moses, this is in 12, by the display to him of all existing things, everything God has made. But by their display, I mean that he will apprehend their nature and the way they are mutually connected, so that he will know how he governs them in general and in detail. So divine actions are the natural events, regularities, processes that science, like the physicians, describes using physicalistic or biological vocabulary. But like the philosophers, Maimonides also offers an alternative vocabulary to describe these divine/natural actions, employing what Maimonides calls attributes of action. These are moral affective predicates like merciful or kind or angry. Okay? Psychological traits we project onto the natural processes by analogy to the moral psychological traits we would use to explain comparable human actions. Okay. Maimonides illustrates this with an example that's especially relevant for us, and I'm just going to read the bold in 13. For instance, one apprehends the kindness of his governance in the production of the embryos of living beings, the bringing of various faculties to existence in them and in those who rear them after birth, faculties that preserve them from destruction and annihilation and protect them against harm and are useful to them in all the doings that are necessary to them. Following this example from biology, Maimonides directs in 14 the governor of a city, if he's a prophet, to acquire similarity to these attributes. In other words, the human prophet or governor, legislator, ruler, should imitate God in his governance and legislation by laying down prescriptions and laws that imitate God's actions, the gnomic biological regularities and events described by predicates like merciful. I want to sharpen Maimonides' characterization of the divine actions imitated by divine law as biological processes and regularities, by contrasting Maimonides with Al-Farabi, who in many ways is his teacher. For Al-Farabi, it's also knowledge of God whom the philosopher-ruler should imitate, but for Al-Farabi, what's divine is metaphysical and cosmological. See this in 15. The relation of the supreme ruler to the most excellent state is similar to the relation of the first cause to the world. And the state itself is organized hierarchically in the same way as the universe. And he elaborates on this hierarchical organization in 16, in bold, just as in the world there's a first principle, God, then other principles subordinate to, the separate intellects, beings that proceed from those principles, the spheres, until they terminate in the beings with the lowest rank in the order of being. So the nation or the city includes a supreme commander, followed by other commanders, followed by other citizens, who in turn are followed by other citizens, until they terminate in the citizens with the lowest rank and citizens and as citizens and human beings. Thus, the city includes the likenesses of the things included in the total world. So for Al-Farabi, the model for the best governance in legislation is cosmology and metaphysics. That was the very knowledge that Moses was denied in Exodus 33, according to Maimonides. Maimonides' biological model for divine/natural law is also, and I'll just mention this, very far from Aquinas' idea of natural law. You can see this in 17. He sums it up. The law of nature is nothing other than the light of intellect, placed within us by God, through which we grasp what's to be done and what is to be avoided. Suffice it to say that Aquinas' conception of natural law are directives that each individual figures out on his own how to act well, that arise simply out of his own rational reflection on the good, on what ought to be desired and done. And again, this is very different from Maimonides' divine/natural law that imitates biological regularities. With this conception of a divine natural law, I want to turn to Maimonides' argument that the Mosaic law is a divine/natural law. On the face of it, the Torah is the exact opposite of a law that aims at the welfare of the soul, to cultivate correct beliefs among citizens and their rational faculty. Its many commandments that cover civil law, torts, and marriage do aim at the welfare of the communal body. But the Torah is full of demonstrably false corporeal descriptions of God, an account of creation and contranatural miracles that conflict with science, and hundreds of rituals and practices, but relatively few, only literally 3 or 4, prescribe beliefs or correct opinions that aim, quote, to perfect the rational faculty. So to meet as conditions for divine law, Maimonides must reconceptualize the Mosaic commandments. This reconceptualization proceeds on many fronts, but I'm going to focus today only on his explanation of the temple cult and animal sacrifice. In the world of ancient Israel, animal sacrifice was overwhelmingly identified with idolatry. And the primary fault or sin of idolatry was the falsity of its underlying beliefs that there exist multiple worship-worthy gods, that God has a body, bodily desires, and that the ultimate worship of God is itself corporeal or bodily by sacrificing, killing animals. The eradication of this body of false beliefs called idolatry is Maimonides repeatedly states, for example in 18, the first intention of the law, to put an end to idolatry. But this raises the question, not only if the point is to put an end to idolatry, why sacrifice was commanded, but given all its idolatrous associations, how could it be commanded? Now, past scholarship on this question has focused on Maimonides' original but controversial methodological hypothesis that these cultic commandments should be explained in light of their historical context of legislation, the fact they grew up among the Sabian idolatrous culture, together with the psychological fact that the ancient Israelites were so deeply entrenched in its idolatrous culture that no one could imagine worship except by animal sacrifice. So the first intention of the law to absolutely eradicate idolatry had to be accommodated, compromised, to people's habits and through their habitual beliefs. And through a divine ruse, or talituf, or subterfuge, the Mosaic law transferred sacrificial worship from created and imaginary things, he writes, to God's own name. So that over time, the memory of idolatry was effaced without forcing the people to do what they could not imagine. Now, this historical and psychological approach is important for Maimonides' story. But I want to focus today on another aspect of his explanation that reflects his conception of a divine natural law. Maimonides prefaces his explanation of sacrifice with a long paragraph, whose first sentence I mentioned earlier. This is 19. If you consider the divine actions, I mean to say the natural actions, the deity's wily graciousness and wisdom as shown in the creation of living beings, and the gradation of the motions of the limbs, and the proximity of some of the latter to others will through them become clear to you. What follows after this is a detailed discussion of human physiology based on Galen, and how the nervous system, brain, spinal marrow cause or explain the movement of limbs through the intermediation of tendons, muscles, fibers, changing from more malleable, liquid, and softer substances to more solid and rigid ones as the intermediate causes approach the rigid limbs to be moved. Maimonides concludes with the following example. 20. Similarly, the deity made a wily and gracious arrangement with respect to all the individuals of the living beings that suck. For when born, such individuals are extremely soft and cannot feed on dry food. Accordingly, breasts were prepared for them so that they should produce milk with a view to their receiving humid food, which is similar to the composition of their bodies, until their limbs gradually and little by little become dry and solid. Recall Maimonides' use of a similar biological phenomenon to exemplify the mutually connected divine actions by which God governs the world in 13. That was the description of the display to Moses, all right, of the natural world, which he's to imitate in his political governance and legislation. Here again, Maimonides uses biological phenomena, especially the breastfeeding of infants, to introduce his principles for the explanation of the commandments, and in particular sacrifice. And I'll read 21. Many things in our law do to something similar to this very governance on the part of him who governs. For sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible, and therefore man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. As at that time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples, in worshiping images and in burning incense before them, his wisdom and his gracious ruse, same term, taltuf, did not require that he give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, and abolition of all these kinds of worship. And through this divine ruse, it came about that the memory of idolatry was effaced, and the existence and oneness of the deity was firmly established. But at the same time, the souls had no feeling of repugnance, were not repelled because of the abolition of modes of worship to which they were accustomed. Maimonides' explanation of the Mosaic commandments of sacrifice is that contrary to appearances, in reality, their first or primary intention or purpose is to inculcate a correct belief as befits a divine law, namely, to efface or refute the false belief in idolatry and establish true belief in God. But the means by which this first intention could be realized are constrained by nature. We immediately encounter, the lawgiver immediately encounters resistance from prior habituated beliefs. Maimonides calls them fantasies that come to humans from the age of infancy, and from the mindsets of people, of humans, who are creatures of habit, who change only step by step. The second or secondary intention of the law is to achieve its ends without violating these constraints of human nature. To achieve its first intention, the divine natural law therefore used a wily ruse or a stratagem, overtly adopting sacrifice, but covertly adapting it to lead to the opposite effect, to wean Israel off its idolatrous habit and guide it to belief in the one God. Because all commandments, despite appearances, are like this. They're means of inculcating correct beliefs and thereby achieving the welfare of the communal soul. It turns out that the Torah, in fact, is a divine natural law. Maimonides' model for this method of explanation is biology, natural science. A first intention of nature is to provide nutrition for all creatures, including babies. But it's necessary for nature to limit the nutritive means to foodstuffs that babies can ingest and digest, liquids like milk rather than dry solids like meat and potatoes. Hence, nature prepared breasts for mothers in order to provide the appropriate nourishment for their babies. This secondary intention for nature to work with and within nature, to be sensitive to, accommodate, adapt itself to natural constraints, is Maimonides' idea of a second intention. Nature itself is constantly balancing its multiple ends and means, making primary first intentions suitable to biological conditions, fitting, adapting, attuning, adjusting multiple ends and ends to means according to its second intention until an equibalanced state is ultimately stable state is realized. The same for divine law. Its equibalence of first and second intentions involves no metaphysics or transcendent divine wisdom. The science of divine law is a branch of natural science. Finally, to conclude, I want to return to our earlier question about tensions within the divine law between the community and individual, between communal welfare and individual perfection. The human's bodily welfare is what moves them to join together in society. But individuals, humans' intellectual perfection of their souls moves them, he writes, to live in solitude, where they're free to dedicate themselves exclusively to intellectual activity. They're not bothered by other people. Okay? This is one tension. A second tension is that as political animals, humans, members of communities, must sometimes take on false beliefs required for communal welfare, like the belief that God gets angry at sinners, which may be necessary to make people obey the law for law and order, but that falsely presupposes that God has, if he's angry, that he has bodily emotions, and of course, a false belief undermines intellectual perfection. So those are two tensions. But the root of the tension, I think, lies in the universality and necessity of the law versus the singularity and contingency of individuals, as we can see in 22. Among the things that you likewise ought to know is the fact that the law does not pay attention to the single case, the individual, things that are few. For in everything that it wishes to bring about is directed only toward the things that occur in the majority of cases and pays no attention to what happens rarely or to the damage occurring to the single human being. For the law is a divine thing, and it's your business to reflect on the natural things in which the general utility necessarily produces damages to individuals. Indeed, all things proceed from one deity and one agent have been given from one shepherd. Governance of the law ought to be absolute and universal, including everyone, even if it's suitable only for certain individuals and not others, for if it were made to fit individuals, the whole would be corrupted. The community-individual tension inherent to law is built into the very fact that it's law, that it's gnomic, that it's universal and absolute, the same for everyone and for all time. For Aristotle and Maimonides, science consists, at least ideally, only in universal and necessary truths. But they also realize that the contingent truths of a natural science, like biology, are true only for the most part or in normal conditions. The same is true for law, and especially divine law, precisely because it's modeled on the laws of nature. Ideally, it should be universal and absolute. That's its first intention. But in reality, it holds only for the majority of time and people. In other words, for normal cases. That's because of the accommodation, the adjustments. And even though no one size fits all, it's logically impossible for law, qua law, to address each particular. If it were addressed individuals, it would be corrupted as law, no longer being law. Hence, because it's one for all, the law is one, a unity. Like the sublunar sphere or natural world, which is, Maimonides says, one mutually interconnected, intraconnected individual from which he, Maimonides, demonstrates that the one has created one being, the world. So Maimonides argues in 22 that in virtue of its equibalanced unity, that we know that the law must proceed from one deity and one agent and have been given from one shepherd. We cannot explain or demonstrate in scholastic terminology propter quid from causes why a law is divine. We can't explain that a law is divine because it was given by the one. But we can infer quia from the effects, from God's works, like laws, right, from the unity of the law, that the one created it. And that's what makes it divine. Thank you.
Thank you. You get to sit down. Okay.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay.
I have it already.
Okay. Okay. We have a technical moment, and then we will have Barbara Hallensleben. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. So I think what we have is the text bilingually.
Yes, exactly. So, dear colleagues of our conference, dear guests, I will speak German now, but I decided to display my whole text just as it is in German and in English. So it is not at all perfect. Maybe the translators will make it more perfect while reading it. It's up to you if you look at the German text or at the English text, or if you just listen, or if you simply do not listen. But I will start. Die beiden öffentlichen Vorträge dieses Abends sind
The two public lectures of this evening are designed to complement each other, although we did not exchange them in advance. One element of the titles is common to both: the state. The historical context of the 12th and 13th centuries makes it clear that we are not dealing with a modern nation state. We must set aside our preconceptions. Renowned historian Wolfgang Reinhardt opens his book History of State Power, Geschichte der Staatsgewalt, with a rather pointed sentence, quote, Europe invented the state. So Reinhardt dates its emergence to the late 18th century and advises the historians, well, they would do well to focus on their respective form of governing with its historically concrete persons and institutions instead of the timelessly abstract state. So let us agree, and that also how I understood my colleague Josef Stern, let us agree to use the term state, der Staat here, as a symbol of the question of how humans can live together successfully as zoon politikon, i.e. in their social constitution. It is salutary and realistic to distance ourselves for a moment from the assumption that we, in Europe, in Western Europe, have solved this question once and for all, and in the sense of the best of all possible worlds. The greatest of all challenges, however, is the theological approach to a fundamentally political question. This is not only unfamiliar, but seems strictly forbidden today altogether. Theologians talk about the divine, the church, and ultimate perfection in the other world. Political scientists and jurists, however, talk about the state and secular laws. However, when we find theological and philosophical statements about the political constitution of humanity in Maimonides and Thomas, we can, of course, historicize this phenomenon and keep it at a distance as ingenious yet pre-modern and pre-enlightened reflections. Here, I will rather make an attempt to extract a few grains of gold from the historical material that may be of significance for today. My reflections revolve around the following thesis with a broad brushstroke, which says, Thomas Aquinas represents the Latin tradition of thought at the threshold where the possibility of thinking about the political world in theological terms will be lost. He himself develops and transmits the principles for bringing forth a political, not politicized theology in a timely manner in every age, also in our age. Now, this thesis is rooted in Thomas's definition of theology, which reads, theology is sacred doctrine, sacra doctrina, deals with God and with all things insofar as they relate to God. So, the wording implies a restriction that should not be overlooked. Sacred doctrine deals, and I quote, with God as the principal object, but with creatures only insofar as they are related to God as their origin and their end. Thus, the unity of science is not threatened. End of quote. This also means the unity of things is never put at risk because they have a common origin and a common goal. A fundamental political principle could even be derived here, saying, whoever wants to govern in this world, i.e. establish unity as peace, must do so by realizing the fundamental principle of unity in God in historical form. Given the time available to me, I will limit myself to 4 aspects. First, the gospel, all power in heaven and on earth. The gospel of Jesus Christ, deeply rooted in the election and history of Israel, is a surprisingly new form of political preaching. All expectations of any worldly reign of the Messiah are disappointed, and yet the words of the risen Lord to the apostles are, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. The Greek word used here is exousia. It empowers the disciples for their mission until the end of the ages. With the same word, the evangelist John grants all those who accept the incarnate Logos in faith the exousia, the power or the faculty to become children of God. In the trial of Jesus, as transmitted in the Gospel of John, the message of the reign of God becomes a political struggle for life and death. The decisive factor in the death sentence against Jesus is the title of king that he does not reject in front of Pilate, as well as the pressure exerted on Pilate with the argument, everyone who makes himself king opposes the emperor. The transfer of the emperor's titles to the Lamb of God in the last book of the Bible, the Revelation of John, is striking, and the Jewish thinker Jakob Taubes presents in strong words in his book, The Political Theology of Paul. Well, by the way, when in the year 1925, Pope Pius XI introduced the Feast of Christ the King, the official title was Feast of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the Universe. universorum. Well, we should have translated the king of all things. The historical context makes the new feast an encouragement. Trust in the possibility of good rule, even in the face of the catastrophic collapse of so many empires in the time around the First World War. A few years later, it became a feast critical of authority, with which the Catholic youth movement in particular demonstratively identified. The immediate occasion was the 1016th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. In professing Jesus as Messiah, something radically new entered the political scene. God's reign, the divine laws, had now been given a human face. When Christians were accused of betraying monotheism, the Church Fathers replied, "We have only one God, but with his oikonomia," which is the oikonomia, the economy of the salvation effective in history through the Son and the Holy Spirit. Christian politics arises under the sign of economy, the economy of salvation. It is not reigning in glory, but participation in the form of servitude in the administration of God's house on earth. Which brings us to the second scene, the emperor as representing Christ. Today, the important role of the emperors in convening and implementing the ecumenical councils is often regarded as a Caesaro-Papist misunderstanding. Yet here, the exousia of the gospel gives rise to an early theology of the dual representation of divine power in history. It can be described even as an early form of the separation of powers. Let us listen to a classic formulation of the doctrine of the so-called two swords theory developed by Pope Gelasius I in a letter to the Eastern Roman Emperor Anastasius. For there are two most exalted emperors by whom this world is governed in the highest place, the sacred authority of the bishops, auctoritas, and the imperial power, potestas. Of these two, the burden of the priests, i.e. the auctoritas, is all the heavier, since they themselves must give account to God's judgment for the kings of men. For you know, most gracious Son, that although you surpass all humanity in dignity, you nevertheless humbly bow your neck before the ministers of divine things and expect from them the means of salvation. End of quote. Secular and ecclesiastical power must neither be merged nor separated from one another. Again, I quote from Gelasius, "This ensures the self-restraint of both orders. Neither can proudly claim to possess both dignities, and each submits to the sphere of activity that belongs to it alone, which, incidentally, cannot be divided spatially into inner and outer life, nor into heaven and earth, but refers to the historical shape of power or rule in good reigns. Even from the Western Roman perspective, a new discovery from the Pope remained the successor of Peter until the beginning of the second millennium, while the title Vicar of Christ, Vicarius Christi, was reserved for the emperor. It was Peter Damiani who first attributed in 1057, the role of Vicar of Christ to Pope Victor II. The dual representation was visible one last time before the fall of the Byzantine Empire, when the Eastern Church delegation to the Council of Florence in 1438-39 was headed jointly by Emperor John Palaiologos VIII and Patriarch Joseph II. Headed jointly. Now, this tradition of mutual restriction of ecclesiastical and secular power can be appreciated, certainly in positive terms. The political order is thus seen as God-given and relatively independent in its historical shape. This is how it is interpreted by the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who devotes a separate chapter to the dual concept auctoritas and potestas in his multi-volume work Homo Sacer on the renewal of political philosophy. The dual of terms already appears in Roman law, where it stands rather mysteriously for the power that, and I quote here, I quote from Agamben, the power that suspends the potestas where it was valid and reactivates it where it was no longer in force. It is a power that suspends and reactivates the law, but does not formally give it validity. It points to the limits of all earthly potestas, which cannot establish itself. In ancient Rome, auctoritas originated from the personal position of the patres, the forefathers. In ecclesiastical terminology, however, the Heavenly Father takes this place, so to speak. Under the title The Kingdom and the Garden, Giorgio Agamben pursues the unusual and yet very creative question: was there anything like politics in paradise? You can weigh the consequences yourselves. If humans are not already political in paradies, a zone political, then politics is a consequence of the fall. So the original sin, i.e. a necessary evil. The question of the lasting accessibility of paradise, affirmed for instance by Dante Alighieri, keeps alive the hope for the success of the political project already in history. Thomas Aquinas agrees. He answers the question of whether, it's a quaestio in the Summa Theologiae, whether there are humans ruled over by humans in paradise with a distinction. He says there was no rule that involved the oppression and enslavement of others, and that was a consequence of sin. However, there were indeed human beings as bearers of dominion, quote, who hold the office of guiding and leading free humans who exist for their own sake. In Latin, causa sui. And this is a reference to metaphysics by Aristotle. This is true because human beings are by nature social beings, animal socialis, zoon politikon, and because it is a good thing to share with others the gift of knowledge, justice, and so to speak, leadership qualities. So, which brings us to the aspect number 3, the break from ecclesiastical hubris to the state's monopoly on the use of force.
From ecclesiastical hubris to the state's monopoly on the use of force.
1274, Thomas dies on his way to the Council of Lyon. Even though political theology is not his primary field of work, he develops all the forms of thought necessary to maintain the precarious balance between ecclesiastical and political power. His constant point of reference is his confession of Jesus as the Messiah. The political potential of his thought is remarkable, even where he does not draw political conclusions. I will mention here just one article in the last part of Thomas' Summa Theologiae that has received too little attention. At the transition between his Christology and the teaching of the sacraments, so where we might expect a doctrine on the Church, which Thomas in fact does not elaborate, Aquinas not only asks about Christ as the head of the Church, he adds the question, is Christ the head of all human beings? His answer is affirmative in a nuanced way, and this is quite remarkable. Christ is the head of those who are in the glory of heaven, the head of those who are united to him in faith and love in the communion of the church, and also the head of all the others who do not yet belong to his body, but have the potential to do so. Two aspects are implied here. Due to the unity of all things in God's reign, a universal horizon is preserved for every particular reign on earth, and due to the unity of all things in God as their origin and goal, rule can only be perceived as the rule of free humans over free humans. We are clearly at a crossroads here. Either this universalism that we've heard from Thomas will become the worst of all strategies for world supremacy, or the humblest gesture of love that moved Charles de Foucault to live with a Tuareg. So this going beyond all limits of the Christian world. So Thomas' reflections on Christ as the head of all human beings led and in Fribourg there has been a habilitation written on it, led the little brother to this testimony and ultimately to his martyrdom. As a side note, I would like to add the understanding of reign as participation in the reign of God achieved through the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah, is not least if understood correctly, a protection against the tragedy of anti-Judaism. I read an article from Sebastian Lalla, who in this article has shown on Thomas Aquinas and Judaism that behind a position of apparent criticism, Thomas held Judaism in high esteem. Forced baptism and injustices towards Jewish communities are rejected, and Thomas emphasizes the special position of the Jewish religion in the context of rational freedom under natural law. Jews should practice their customs and are sought after as partners in philosophical and theological dialogue. The numerous constructive references to Maimonides in Thomas' work that we've will investigate in this conference express this attitude. In fact, shortly after Thomas' death, the disastrous break starts. The dual representation of power in the separation of power between the church auctoritas and the political potestas, this is being abolished by Pope Boniface VIII, uniting all divine authority in the papacy. This became apparent in his bull Unam Sanctam in 1302. The Gelasius doctrine of the two swords was interpreted in such a way that the judgment of the church in secular matters was transformed into an immediate political judgment. Pope Boniface is convinced that since the church itself is the divine authority and no longer merely represents it, secular governments must submit to the church. And now, the interesting and real historic connection, so not only the one I construed historically. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes counters with an entirely logical argument, explicitly referring to Boniface, and he says, if spiritual and secular power merge in the Pope into one single power, and this is good, one power is good, then it is better to place it in the unity of the political order, the worldly order, so it has a better place in the unity of the political order, according to Hobbes, in the sovereign state of the Leviathan. The political thinker Carl Schmitt comments, in Hobbes, the clear state antithesis to the Roman Catholic monopoly of decision-making finally breaks up. It is truly the expression of the completed Reformation, whose half-hearted first step was the ecclesiastical Reformation. The hubris of the Church provokes the monopoly of power of the state. Indeed, the Reformation in the 16th century intensifies the political impulse. During this period, experience led to the conviction that the Christian creed was not suitable for maintaining public order and guaranteeing peace. So during the confessional wars that followed the Reformation, the princes were only able to prevail against the conflicting religious parties, and I quote, if they broke the primacy of religion. The absolute prince recognized no authority above himself other than God, but no longer the God, Jesus Christ and Father, but the God that legitimizes his reign, whose attributes he assumes for himself in the political and historical sphere, according to the historian Rainer Koselleck. The new unity of powers becomes total and thus susceptible to totalitarianism. Both variants of power politics, the ecclesiastical and the secular, which are only two sides of the same coin, so which are interwoven, failed. Boniface VIII lost his life after an assassination attempt, which was probably ordered by Philip IV of France. He made the Church dependent on the French kings and, with his excessive claim to power, plunged the Church into a crisis lasting centuries, which culminated in the Reformation. And Thomas Hobbes? His Leviathan ultimately failed because of his success, as Reinhard Koselleck points out. To the extent that the absolutist state was able to pacify the era of confessional civil wars, submission to the sovereign was no longer plausible. What remains is secular politics and secular laws without heavenly politics, economics without providence, and bureaucracy without spirit. And the last part, idolatry in a secular world. This basically brings us to the so-called secular age. However, already the headline seems contradictory, because isn't the secular world overcoming the idolization of power in its ecclesiastical and secular forms? Taking into account the developments outlined above, we can understand the liberating connotation associated with the proclamation of the secular. Our historical memory still remembers the bitter religious wars that followed the Reformation. A religiously neutral system of government emerged from this destruction. We still remember totalitarian political ideologies whose self-deification led to the oppression and even extermination of millions of humans by other humans. The never again still echoes in our hearts, and we must not allow this voice at any price to be silenced. In today's diversity and encounter of religions and worldviews, a secular order seems to be the only way to live together in peace and freedom. We want neither an Islamic state nor a Christian theocracy. And yet, we may have only achieved half the solution. We have disenchanted the world and believed that it is free of gods and God now. Max Weber, who described the rationalization movement of the 19th century, already warned in 1917, the old gods, disenchanted and therefore in the form of impersonal forces, are rising from their graves, striving for power over our lives and beginning their eternal struggle with each other once again. In German-speaking theology, I'm currently observing search for traces of the holy, especially in art and culture, which, as such, Charles Taylor says, at least in some places, to break through the buffered cold world of the secular. The American theologian William T. Cavanaugh, who works in Chicago, takes a different perspective. In a supposedly secular world, he discovers the old and new gods and idols that we still worship. They surround us with tempting consumer offers, party and interest struggles, manipulative slogans, aggressive image floods, etc. Unlike the God, Jesus Christ, they do not want to set us free, but they enslave us. They do not reveal themselves, they want to disguise themselves. The new temples are shopping centers, sports and music events, electronic media and AI with their promises of salvation. The new liturgies have strict rituals and are not even limited to Sundays. People no longer make pilgrimages to places of worship and in processions, but to holiday resorts, museums and gay parades, and so on. We do not live in a secular world at all, but in a highly sacralized one, according to Cavanaugh's phenomenologically well-founded thesis. He puts it under the title Migrations of the Holy and reveals, not least, the sacred character of the nation-state. Well, we have painfully learned that the unity of power is dangerous. It needs a limiting counterpart. This knowledge of the necessary separation of powers has turned into a finite power game. Finite earthly power controls finite earthly power. Is it really the common good that guides us? Or is it rather the barely concealed self-interest that only reluctantly submits to the rules of the game? The now abstract principle of unity, known as peace or common welfare, is barely recognizable behind the plurality of forces. The massive armament that accompanies the strategy seems more threatening than reassuring. The answer that Thomas Aquinas stands for points to the second, missing half of the solution. All power is representation of the one divine power. The testimonies of salvation history give us the confidence that this God is the source of peace and justice for all, in concrete, historic, and thus also natural form. So Christians, Jews, Muslims, and many others, with their commitment to unity in God beyond affirmed diversity, serve not only the salvation of souls, but also the success of the ambiguous project called the state. Let us now draw some preliminary conclusions, which mark only the beginning of our common task here at this conference. The deep roots of our political culture, for the best as well as for the worst, can be found in the history of our cultural circle. In the time of Maimonides and Thomas, course-setting decisions were made that have shaped us so much that we are still not fully able to gain distance from them through reflection. So perhaps the conference we are attending is much more relevant for today than its title suggests. Perhaps it will open up unexpected perspectives, especially for Christian-Jewish dialogue, and not least for the mutual self-perception of the secular world and religion. Cavanaugh concludes his book with a simple and wise political principle that can guide us, drawing on Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God. Verse 11. And it is God who makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. Verse 10. Cavanaugh concludes, violence arises when we forget God is God and I am not God.
I'd like to thank both of our keynote speakers. And are you okay? Can you get through?
Don't worry.
And I'm going to allow first 1 or 2 minutes to see if they have comments or questions for each other, and then we will open the floor. And when we do, I understand there is a microphone that will be traveling around. But first, comments or questions for each other?
Joseph. I'm still exhausted, so
well, thank you for this very interesting paper. I would say that Maimonides would agree with Kavanaugh's conclusion, your last words. Violence arises when we forget God is God and I am not God. In a passage in the guide, when he describes, he doesn't talk about the Messianic age in the guide, except for this one passage in which he says that at that time the violence will cease because everyone, the cause of violence, and violence is a paradigm of evil, is ignorance. So when everyone has knowledge, okay, when knowledge becomes our only value, then there will be a kind of, now evil will cease, mutual evil between human beings, violence will cease. And he uses as the example, he cites the proof text about the lamb lying down with the wolf, okay? But it's primarily a type of knowledge. And the knowledge is, for the highest knowledge for him is knowledge of the unity of God. So the kind of, he'll agree with you that it's the result of forgetting, of ignorance, right, of who God is God, that God is God and I, the human being, is not God. But it's deeper. But there's a deep difference there between, I think, Maimonides and Aquinas, because for Aquinas, in knowing that I'm not God and that God is God, nonetheless, it's the unity of God, as you said earlier, that should guide our politics. All right, and it's a kind of metaphysical picture that should guide our politics. The unity of God, okay, as a higher transcendent kind of wisdom. But for Maimonides, the knowledge that I'm not God is knowledge that the reason I'm not God is that I'm not a unity. I'm matter and form. I'm body and intellect. And whatever kind of unity I achieve is going to be the result of a accommodation, as I was saying, a type of adjustment. It's always going to be second best, right? The ideal will never be realized, and that's because I'm not God. Okay, so there's both a sort of commonality there, but there's also, I think, a very, very deep difference between the two thinkers.
Thank you so much. It's what I've felt too. So first of all, I think our approach had something in common. So we both started with the question, how can we achieve human perfection, the perfection of the individual and the perfection of the community, of the social being. So, and in my opinion, it's quite relevant to ask this question again and to look what we can contribute and how we do so. So the concept that struck me in your presentation was talking about divine natural law. And I think if we would reflect on it, we could probably find some common ground for Maimonides and Thomas, but maybe in a different way. Because natural, you showed very well that nature is not something that is completely separated from God, that is something else. But there is a link, but it's clearly nature. So I think Thomas would agree, but Thomas would say, or the reference in Thomas is the incarnation. So this means law has received a human face. But the fact that law has received a human face shows that the human part of this incarnated Christ is truly human. Maybe during the Council of Nicaea, of course, the divine aspect was strengthened. But all the councils that followed more and more affirmed truly human, truly bodily, truly free will. So this means that exactly the revelation and exactly the transcendent affirms by becoming a human being that this natural aspect is not outside God, it is free, it is something else than divine, it's not governed from outside, it can realize itself as a created nature in itself. And I think we could find more in common, I imagine. I think we have to discuss a lot, and I'm looking forward to it.
Let me just say one thing in response that I had to cut out from the paper. When Maimonides makes these claims, the divine is the natural, he always uses divine and natural as adjectives, as modifiers, as in attributive form. He never uses the nominals, God and nature. Moshe Idol actually has argued that that sentence that I quoted, the divine actions as natural, I mean the natural actions, was interpreted by Cordoveros, a later Kabbalistic thinker, as God is nature, and that led to Spinoza's pantheism. But it's very clear that Maimonides is interpreting divine there not as God, all right? It's attributive form, okay, and natural. So he never says God is nature, so he wouldn't agree with the incarnation at all, that God becomes a human, okay? It's simply in this other sense. I'd say that he, as it were, Maimonides takes God out of divine and divine law, okay? So I think there's a huge difference there. I mean, it's naturalism as opposed to any metaphysics. But
we will continue to talk about it, but I think there is a lot of wisdom here in the room to react.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. This is a question for the professor from Fribourg. I have some concerns about the historical analysis on, I should say, a systematic and a historical concern. And the historical concern is this. In Aquinas, you find very similar language about subordination of temporal government to the church in his De Regno, and the obligation that the state, the rulers of the state, as I said, you mentioned there's no state, but the king and temporal rulers have to submit to the church. And there's a lot of that in Aquinas. His student, Ptolemy of Lucca, has more republican intuitions on some of this, but I don't think that begins with unam sanctam and that. I wonder about that story because there's certainly subordination. The second point is it seems to me that very similarly the story about hubris and a monopoly of power in the church, I worry particularly that the problem is really an age-old problem that we're also experiencing, which is something like this. The church seemed to have functioned in the Middle Ages as something of a United Nations to determine questions about warfare between countries and, law, international law. And what happened is either it was powerless at certain points precisely because not everybody accepted its authority, or it was used as a sort of political football. Different groups tried to take over the church and use it for their own purposes. And I think, in fact, the church was pretty powerless at many of these stages, like the Council of Constance. As you get further through the Middle Ages, unam sanctam, Boniface VIII seems to be writing it precisely because he has no authority whatsoever. So it looks like we're experiencing a similar problem today with international institutions. where the UN suffers from similar problems. People don't enforce ICC judgments. So I guess my question at the end of the day is what role could subordination of the state to the church, that seems to be the only viable sort of thing that I can see coming out of some of this, what role should that play in contemporary government today?
So maybe I can answer shortly, because I think I'm most glad that my presentation provoked so huge questions concerning our political world and questions of today. I think we need to discuss them, and we need to discover that they have deep roots in our history. My point was only one point, showing that the tendency to unite the power, either in church or in the so-called or real nation state of today, will always provoke the tendency to self-sacralization and to totalitarianism. And of course, I did not want at all, it's the opposite, I did not want to identify Thomas and Boniface. We should discuss it in detail, but Boniface is at least, especially in his powerlessness, a sign that this way of merging the power into one power will always lose in history and will always break down.
Stefan. So, my name's Harriet Murphy, and I was very interested in your paper, Professor Hallensleben. I'm just wondering why you didn't take the story forward to the Second Vatican Council and Dignitatis Humanae, because this question about the subservience of the state to the church seems to be obsolete and irrelevant, whereas the church has actually clarified in no uncertain terms that we, each of us, carry within us the ontological right to religious freedom, and that applies to Jews and Muslims and so on. So the question from my point of view has been authoritatively resolved, and all we have to do is keep with Dignitatis Humanae and keep enforcing our human rights as individuals in that particular frame, recognizing that tensions between church and state have really been resolved in favor of this portable human right. Thank you.
So the first part of the answer is very easy. If you would give me 3 hours instead of 30 minutes, I can continue with the council. The second answer may be more differentiated, and it means if you have a principle, and I fully agree that Dignitatis Humanae opens really a new perspective compared with this history of the church, but it has to be realized. And what it means to be realized in today's political world, where states declare religious freedom but do not respect it, we have to work on it on a more profound way and not talk about the political aspect of our Christian confession simply in the way of working inside the political order as a kind of ethical force, but discussing what the theological roots of the political order are and how we constitute the living together in the political world. And there we did not work enough. So I concentrated on this aspect.
I have a question for both speakers, but then mainly for Josef. My question is about the reception of Aristotle by Thomas and by Maimonides. Okay, do you see a difference in receiving Aristotle's thought in the two thinkers you were talking about? But to Josef, in particular, the remark you made in responding to the other speaker about taking God out of the equation when it comes to the divine. Now, my question is Maimonides' relationship to Al-Farabi and the understanding of Aristotle and Al-Farabi and for the Islamic world. Do you see a difference there when it comes to the understanding of God in the discussion of Maimonides in relation to Al-Farabi's understanding of Aristotle? I mean, is this the salvation of a notion of God that is different from, let's say, the more natural understanding of the divine in Al-Farabi, or am I wrong here in making that distinction?
Who should answer first? It was for both. It was for me. Yes. Okay. Maimonides' knowledge of Aristotle was entirely through the lens of commentators. He never read Aristotle alone, so he was reading him through late Hellenistic commentators like Alexander or Themistius, and through the Arab commentators, Al-Farabi and Avicenna. Whether he knew Averroes is a question of controversy. How much of the commentaries he knew of Averroes, that's a matter of scholarship that's under debate. But now Al-Farabi's and Avicenna's understandings of Aristotle, you have to use these terms, but they're too crude. It was a certain reading of Aristotle, which is often called Neoplatonic, okay? Again, that's a crude stereotype, okay? But so it's not a pure Aristotle, okay? That's number one. So he's reading Aristotle through these commentators who are themselves reading Aristotle through a type of Neoplatonized lens, okay? And you have to look at specific cases in order to give a more nuanced answer. But on my view, Maimonides, although he grows out of an Aristotelian, this Neoplatonized, Arabized Aristotelian context, he's a critic of the philosophers and of Aristotle. Richard said earlier that the term philosophers is often used to refer to Avicenna. And we can argue whether it's specifically Avicenna that he's referring to. In this context, he doesn't use the term philosophers, okay? But he's a critic of Avicenna and Al-Farabi. And he's a critic of them because their interpretations are a much more metaphysicized interpretation of Aristotle, okay? For Maimonides, God is in the picture. I mean, I said taking me out of divine law. Yes, it's naturalized, right? It's a naturalistic account. God is always the first cause. That's part of your naturalism, all right? You can keep on asking for explanations, all right? And you have to either stop someplace because it's otherwise you'll have an infinite regress, all right? Or because you're actually also looking for an explanation of the unity of things. And you need a first principle in order to give unity. So he's definitely, he has familiarity with Aristotle. He's reading it through the lenses of these people, and he's also often criticizing it.
I have a question from Professor Albestein. First, thank you for very deep historical and philosophical explanation. It was worth all the way from Jerusalem to hear this. And that's the first thing. I want just to add three very little historical points. I think that if we see the status of a Jewish community in Europe, I think is a very good point to your argumentation, because a few years after the death of Thomas and after the transformation and the unification of the power, come the position that one state, one church, one religion, and the expulsion of a Jewish community beginning in India in 1292, finish in Portugal in 1497-98, and the arch-enemy of Thomas in theology is Don Scott. He was probably one of the ideologists of this theory. Another point I think is that Maimonides is very near Thomas in this point. When we read in Ilchot Melachim of Law of Kings, the last part of Mishneh Torah, I think the dualism between the king and the Sanhedrin, the High Tribunal, are quite similar, not exactly the same, but quite similar. And that is very interesting that they are both different from Plato. Plato is more a unique theory, and I think they are both different. By opposite, Spinoza put the church under the state, and we begin to scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this addition, important supplement.
All right, hello. My name is Natalia. I'm studying here at HU, and I have a question to you, Professor Stern, regarding the idea of the divine natural law. So, how Maimonides could formulate the idea in terms of was there any reflection on the possibility of the reason itself? Because was there any reflection on reason itself or on the capacity of reasoning? And this like goes in the direction of the distinction between like metaphysics, how like in the tradition of Aristotle, and modern metaphysics in the critique of Kant, like the question of how could we make founded claims about metaphysical objects. So is there like already any reflection on that in this idea of the divine natural law?
The divine natural law, as I said, has as its end, okay, the welfare of the soul of the community, okay, and that's the development, the cultivation, okay, of their rational faculties. The cultivation of the rational faculty is not itself a perfection, right? Perfection is always of the individual. But the cultivation of the rational faculty of the community, okay, is a matter of, I said, an appreciation of the value of wisdom. It's a matter of cultivating a power, an ability, a disposition under certain circumstances, right, to actually, for certain individuals, to actually perfect their intellects, okay? Now, whether that perfection of the intellect includes knowledge of metaphysics is a further question, okay? I can't go into this in length, but I think Maimonides is extremely aware of the limitations of the human intellect, the most that any human, all right, can achieve. Remember, Moses is denied knowledge, all right, of God's essence, metaphysics, all right? And what that means in Maimonides' epistemology, when God denies him, says no, it means that Moses comes to the realization himself through his own rational faculty that he cannot have knowledge of metaphysics. By knowledge he means, again, it's scientific, it's episteme, ilm, full understanding, the possibility of giving an explanation, an explication, all right, of, let's say, of God's existence and his unity. Maimonides realizes that that knowledge is not to be had, and if he realizes that he can't have that knowledge, he no longer then, it's impossible for him to have that knowledge. He's no longer going to have even the desire to seek that knowledge, all right? So he disabuses himself of that desire. That's a very, very strong form of what the skeptics called epoche, suspension of judgment. Right? He gives up even that drive, okay, to achieve that sort of knowledge. So and the fact that his explanation of the divine law makes no reference, it appeals to no metaphysical principles. Okay, it's all in terms of natural science. I think it's precisely because he's a skeptic about the possibility of knowledge of metaphysics. Okay. I hope that answers your question.
I have a very philosophical question, but I start with the very political question. How can your way of conceiving with Maimonides a divine natural law become a guide of the perplexed politicians?
Perplexed rulers? I mean, legislators?
Not philosophers now, but politicians. So how can this way of thinking of Maimonides become, today hopefully, a guide for the perplexed?
Well,
for the political order of today.
Okay. Unfortunately, he distinguishes between prophets, all right, whose laws are divine laws, and between politicians, rulers, all right, whose laws are simply nomoi, okay, who only seek the welfare of the bodies of the community, all right, law and order and satisfaction of bodily needs, okay. He distinguishes sharply. Furthermore, although he allows for, I mean, this goes back to that question about Aristotle. He uses this notion of emanation, overflow, okay, which is a Neoplatonic idea, which he reads into, sort of Aristotle. He also allows for overflow, emanation. This is contrary to most of his Arabic predecessors. Well, I shouldn't say that. He uses the notion emanation in a very, very thin sense, all right? There's an emanation to the imaginations of the politicians, okay? The emanation to the prophets is to their intellects, okay? It's to their intellects, although it's through the imagination, okay? So he distinguishes, all right, between these two classes of human beings who legislate laws. So there's a very, and there's two kinds of perplexity then. There can be the perplexity of the prophets that leads to knowledge of the limitations. And then there's the perplexity of the legislators of the nomoi, who deceive themselves into thinking that what they imagine is what the intellect tells them to do. So these people are really confused. They're deluded, all right, about what their own self-knowledge is.
But in the political world, they should interact somehow, so that the prophets become an inspiration for those who only care for the bodies or for the nomoi, or doesn't he see this fruitful interaction?
If that were only the case.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what we all hope.
Era, maybe that will be the case. I mean, there are a lot of nuances you can give into this story. I mean, there's this remarkable book by Al-Farabi called the Book of Letters, in which he describes the origins of different kinds of religions. Religion is an imitation of philosophy, but there are different kinds of philosophy. There's sophistics, there's dialectic, there's demonstrative philosophy, and then there are imitations of those in religion. But there can be very nuanced, a lot of nuances and variations of these imitations. All right, can lead to all sorts of conflicts between the philosophers and the prophets. You don't find this full sort of, typology in Maimonides, but I couldn't talk about this. He does think of the law also as a kind of imaginative, interpretation of philosophy, or an imitation of philosophy. He has a theory of that the commandments in the Torah are there. He thinks they can be interpreted on multiple levels. One level is as law, which I was talking about today. But on another level, for the philosophers, certain individual commandments, at least, can be interpreted as exercises, training for individual perfection. So there are a lot of different moves that go on. I just couldn't go into all this. Yeah. I'm
going to just jump in and humbly add one one sentence here to your question, that Maimonides also had behind him the entire biblical problem of the separation of the political and the prophetic, where the prophetic tries very hard to bring the political to a more just and righteous realization, and fails. And that's part of recognizing the human condition that is part of Maimonides' unavoidable background, right? So I think we have a...
I was going to ask something technical before, both to Joseph and to Barbara, but as the conversation proceeded, and especially your comments, Barbara, at the end of your talk, I was trying to think of where the two positions, Aquinas and Maimonides, can converge, because the way Joseph defined the difference between divine law and nomos, and Thomas's project of defending sacred doctrine doesn't seem to be kind of a common ground. However, there is, when you talked about some common ground, and you talked about, and Joseph mentioned the summit of human knowledge, that he mentioned it in one of his sources, is when Moses asks for certain kinds of knowledge. He's denied knowledge of metaphysics or the essence of God. The essence of God. Let's say the essence of God. But the summit of human knowledge is really, in a way, letting Moses see what God saw, the goodness of creation, where he says everything's mutually integrated. There's the idea of integration and mutual connection. And so when you talked about self-deification, I mean, we are sitting in a city, for me at least, I think for lots of people, are haunted by a lot of ghosts, and ghosts left over by the self-deification, I think was the crime, the ultimate moral crime. When you take that summit of human knowledge, there's an endless debate in Maimonides about what the summum bonum is, whether it's knowledge or intellect, or whether it's ethics. But whatever side you end up on in this debate, the ethical consequences of what Joseph was talking about, where you end up spending a lifetime developing the most learned, in the most learned state possible, that you don't know anything, that has its ethical consequence. So that has its ethical consequence. That is a bar to self-deification. That is, you can in some sense say that this project of heading towards learned ignorance is the restraint against self-deification. And in fact, Maimonides does in the guide, in the code of law, actually equate arrogance, ga'ava, hubris, with a denial of a fundamental principle. That is, for him, it is a fundamental denial of God, because hubris leaves no place for anything else besides yourself. So I think the kind of conversation here, there is a convergence here towards this summum bonum, which has this ethical consequence that restrains self-deification. So it was just a comment, but I'd like to hear if there is some time.
I like the question of how we spend our lifetime, because this is a question which we really have in common. I think Thomas, maybe myself, I would answer with Thomas, spending your lifetime in avoiding self-deification for a Christian is to go for self-sanctification, to live in the church, to praise God, to celebrate liturgy, to transform this world by receiving sacraments and by proclaiming the gospel, by becoming prophets for our world, without having the idea that everybody should submit to me, but bring more love into this world, and not in an ethical way, but taking seriously the word of Paul, saying, it's no longer myself who is living, it's Christ living and acting through myself. in all humility. This would be the Christian project in a very short form. What I put in my answer, my question, and this is the concept of metaphysics, which always appears in your context in a negative way, and I understand it. I also have been speaking against any abstract concepts which go out our bodily existence and so on. But the project of incarnation is in the same moment something coming, implying a sort of meta of not just a fact. It's going beyond what you see with your physical eyes. It's a matter. It's a divine. It's not just something purely existing. So what does this negative concept of metaphysics mean? And where does Maimonides and you with him deal with some kind of transcendence, some kind of going beyond a knowledge, a way of acting, which everybody can see and what everybody can do? Where does this divine come from? Where does a kind of negative theology or this transcendent God, but anyway present in the natural things, where does it appear? What is God? What's the difference between God and the divine? You see, I'm looking even for the question.
Yeah. I'm not going to talk about incarnation, but maybe this will respond to your question, okay? And to Jim's point. Maimonides begins the first chapter of the guide by criticizing interpretations that God created man in his image, okay? The salmo, that the word tselem or image there means corporeal shape. He calls that the pure doctrine of corporeality of God. That God has a human's bodily shape, just bigger and better version of that. We usually think of anthropomorphism as thinking of God as having a human's body, okay? And Maimonides considers anthropomorphism, which he's calling here, and he's calling, so instead of anthropomorphism, Maimonides is calling anthropomorphism corporealism about God. From Maimonides, corporealism about God is the heart of idolatry, thinking of God as a body, okay? But he goes on in that chapter, in the last part of that chapter, he says, if God's not a body, what is he? So he reinterprets this term image as meaning the intellect, the form, the specific form, okay? Okay, as an intellect. And that is a second interpretation of the word image, which he then goes on to develop in certain places in the guide. But it's not his last word about this word image. And at the end, in the last paragraph of that chapter, he goes to, in the next chapter, he goes at great length to say that really God is not an intellect, okay? Okay? I can't go into the details, but he says God is not an intellect. Now, if you want to really find if you really want to find the root of anthropomorphism, it's not going to be corporealism, because animals also have bodies. What's distinctive to a human being, all right, is that he has an intellect, okay? So to think of God as an intellect would be the height of anthropomorphism, right? That would be then the height of idolatry, okay? So he rejects the idea that God is an intellect, all right? Because that's simply a projection onto God of a certain kind of anthropomorphic conception of the human being, okay? How then where does the transcendence come in? Well, what I've tried, I can't, again, go through the details. In various passages in the guide, after he points out the limitations of the human intellect in trying to understand metaphysics. He follows these arguments with formulae like, I am dazzled by the light. The master of the will perplexes me, right? On my view, these are not simply formulaic refrains. These are expressive states in which Maimonides, okay, puts himself, all right, as a result of his recognition of the limitations of the human intellect, all right? These are states of dazzlement, of worship, of awe before God, okay, which are parallel to what the dogmatist, the Aristotelian, thinks you achieve by having knowledge of God, knowledge of metaphysics. For Maimonides, it's precisely the point at which you recognize the limitations of your intellect that leads to this sharp awareness of this thing. You don't know anything about it, you have no understanding of it, but that it's completely transcendent to you. It's really beyond your understanding. And that's where this kind of transcendence comes in, all right? It's very, I mean, I've compared this in my writings to the state of tranquility, which is a skeptic's, all right, form of eudaimonia, of happiness, the state in which the skeptic puts himself precisely at the moment that he suspends judgment, all right? He achieves his own brand of eudaimonia, precisely tranquility, ataraxia, all right, precisely, all right, parallel to what the dogmatist thought he could achieve through knowledge. So that's where I think the transcendence, this kind of, if you want to call it, it's an experience. It's not a mystical experience at all. There's no union, all right? It's the opposite.
Would you call it a negative theology, or is it too much already?
It's the word negative theology has a lot of different meanings. I mean, he recognizes he's not God. When he talks about negative attributes, which is what most people mean by negative theology, most people think that he's an advocate of negative theology, that you can't make positive, affirmative attributions to God. That doesn't give you knowledge. They think you get some kind of knowledge in knowing what God is not, and that's closer to what Dionysus thought. All right, and the classical Nick. But for Maimonides is actually, in my view, a critic of negative attributes. He thinks they're also false because of they also assume that let's say the sentence God is one, all right, has a subject and it has an attribute. And that violates God's unity. So he thinks those are false. They're better than affirmative attributes, but they're still false propositions. So they give you, and what's false can't be knowledge. So they give you no knowledge of God. But that's a long story.
We just stopped the dialogue. So
we can go on for hours.
Right. Unfortunately, however, we can't in this venue. So we will have to continue our talking about this. And I'd like to thank both of our keynote speakers so we can...
Our kind moderator.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. For all of you who are listening online, thank you as well. And is there a small, yes, there's a small opportunity to discuss these minor issues that we have begun to discuss here outside with some water and some wine, and you are welcome to join us. Thank you very much. No, don't let her go.